The static crackled through the emergency radio like dying stars, each pop and hiss carrying the weight of 17 years of silence. Captain Sarah Chen pressed the headphones tighter against her ears, her calloused fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency dial one more time. The numbers glowed green in the dim basement of her Phoenix apartment. 121.5 megahertz, the universal emergency frequency her father had taught her when she was 12. Back when the world still made sense and Colonel Marcus Chen came home every night, smelling of jet fuel and determination. This is Ghost 77, if anyone's listening. The birds are sleeping where the sun dies twice. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The voice cut through the static like a blade through silk, weathered and desperate, carrying the unmistakable cadence of military precision wrapped in exhaustion. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It had read her bedtime stories, taught her to change oil in their old Mustang, and promised her that pilots always come home. It was impossible. Colonel Marcus Chen had been declared dead 17 years ago, when his F-16 Fighting Falcon vanished over the Nevada desert during a classified training mission. No wreckage, no body, no answers. Just a folded flag and a Purple Heart that never filled the hole in their family. But impossible things had been Sarah's specialty since she'd joined the Air Force herself, following in footsteps that had led nowhere. Now 34, with her own captain's bars and a reputation for finding needles in haystacks, she specialized in aircraft recovery, locating downed planes, analyzing crash sites, bringing closure to families who waited in the same hollow silence. She'd known since she was 17. The message repeated, crackling through the speakers like a ghost learning to speak. This is Ghost 77. The coordinates are where the mountains kiss the sky. 36 degrees, 47 minutes north, 115 degrees, 32 minutes west. Tell my Sarah... The eagles never forgot how to fly. Sarah's hands shook as she grabbed a pen, scribbling the coordinates on the back of an old photograph, the last one taken of her and her father, both grinning beside his F-16 at Nellis Air Force Base, the morning sun painting everything gold. The numbers swam before her eyes as tears she'd held back for nearly 2 decades finally broke free. Those coordinates weren't random. They pointed to a location deep in the Nevada desert, in the restricted airspace where her father's squadron had been conducting routine training exercises. The day he disappeared, the basement around her seemed to shrink, filled with the detritus of her 17-year obsession, aviation charts papering the walls like desperate prayers. Boxes of declassified documents marked with yellow highlighter, a massive corkboard connected by red string that would make conspiracy theorists weep with envy. Her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, a 70-year-old widow who brought her tamales and worried about her mental health, often joked that Sarah's basement looked like the lair of a beautiful madwoman. Sarah never argued. Madness and dedication were separated by the thinnest of lines, and she'd been walking that tightrope since the day her mother, Elena, had finally stopped setting a place for Marcus at the dinner table. If you're enjoying this incredible story of mystery and discovery, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring you more amazing stories like this one. She played the message again, analyzing every breath, every pause, every subtle inflection that might prove or disprove what her heart already knew. The voice recognition software on her laptop would take hours to process, but her soul had already rendered its verdict. Her father was alive, or had been alive long enough to leave her a breadcrumb trail through the desert of her grief. The coordinates led to the Yucca Mountain region, a place where the government tested things that didn't officially exist and buried secrets deeper than nuclear waste. Sarah had flown over that terrain dozens of times during her own missions, noting the strange geometric patterns carved into the desert floor, patterns that looked almost like ... runways, abandoned runways that didn't appear on any official map, leading to hangars that cast shadows too large for their supposed contents. She pulled up the satellite imagery on her computer, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced urgency. The Nevada test site sprawled across the screen in muted browns and grays, a moonscape of craters and geometric scars, where humanity had tested its capacity for destruction. But there, nestled between two mountain ridges like a secret whispered, between lovers, were the structures she'd noticed before but never investigated. Rectangular buildings, long strips of asphalt, and something else, something that made her pulse quicken with recognition. Aircraft, dozens of them, arranged in perfect rows like sleeping giants. The satellite image was months old, and the resolution poor, but Sarah's trained eye could identify the silhouettes: F-16s, F-15s, A-10 Warthogs, and shapes she didn't recognize: angular, predatory forms that belonged to no aircraft in any manual she'd studied. They sat in the desert like monuments to forgotten wars, slowly being reclaimed by sand and time. Her phone buzzed against the wooden desk, the vibration traveling through her bones like a tuning fork struck in a cathedral. The caller ID showed Rodriguez Maria, her neighbor, probably wondering why Sarah's lights had been on for 3 straight days. Sarah let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt guilty. Maria Rodriguez had been more of a mother to her than her own mother had. Managed after Marcus disappeared. Mom never gave up hope, Sarah told her father through her tears. She kept your coffee mug on the counter for 10 years. She used to stand at the window every evening, watching for your plane to come home. She loved you until the day she died, Dad. She never remarried, never moved on. You were the love of her life. People could die of sadness, slowly and quietly, like flowers forgetting how to bloom. The radio crackled again, just static now, but Sarah kept listening. In her experience, the dead rarely spoke just once. They had things to say, stories to tell, mysteries to unravel. And if her father was out there, had been out there all these years, then someone had deliberately hidden him. Someone had let her family disintegrate while he fought to come home. She thought about her partner, Major Jake Morrison, currently deployed in Afghanistan, analyzing drone footage and counting the days until his rotation ended. Jake understood her obsession with lost aircraft because he'd grown up with a father who'd vanished in Vietnam, leaving behind only questions, and a son who'd spent 30 years searching foreign jungles for answers that might never come. They'd bonded over their shared expertise in finding the unfindable, their relationship built on mutual respect and the unspoken understanding that some wounds never heal. They just learned to bleed more quietly. Jake would tell her to report the radio transmission through proper channels, to let the bureaucracy handle whatever classified nightmare had swallowed her father. But Sarah had tried proper channels for 17 years. She'd filed Freedom of Information Act, requests that came back so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art. She'd interviewed retired pilots who suddenly developed selective amnesia when she mentioned her father's name. She'd even dated a Pentagon analyst for 6 months, hoping he might slip and reveal something useful after a few drinks and whispered promises. He'd transferred to Guam instead. The coordinates burned in her mind like a brand. 36 degrees, 47 minutes north, 115 degrees, 32 minutes west. In the morning, she would request leave. She would drive to Nevada with camping gear and surveillance equipment and enough determination to move mountains. She would find whatever was hidden in that desert graveyard, even if it destroyed her career and confirmed her reputation as the crazy pilot who couldn't let go of ghosts. But tonight, she sat in her basement surrounded by 17 years of accumulated hope and evidence, listening to the voice of a dead man who might still be dying, who had somehow found a way to reach across an impossible distance and whisper her name. The photograph on her desk seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, her 17-year-old self grinning beside the father who'd promised to always come home. She touched his face through the glass, her finger tracing the smile lines around his eyes. "I hear you, Dad," she whispered to the static-filled silence. "I'm coming." Outside, Phoenix slept under a blanket of desert stars. The same stars that shone over Nevada, over whatever secrets waited in the coordinates her father had died to share. The radio hissed softly, like wind through abandoned hangars, carrying the echo of promises kept too late and love that refused to accept the finality of death. Tomorrow, the search will begin again. But tonight, for the first time in 17 years, Sarah Chen was no longer searching alone. The alarm screamed at 0500 hours, but Sarah had been awake since 0300, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling while her mind replayed the radio message on an endless loop. Her apartment felt different now, charged with possibility and weighted with dread. The familiar routine of morning PT, shower, uniform, and coffee tasted like preparation for something that would either save her or destroy her completely. At Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her body executing the familiar choreography of military life while her soul vibrated at a frequency only she could hear. Lieutenant Amy Park, her research assistant and the closest thing she had to a best friend, noticed immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Amy said, sliding a steaming cup of terrible office coffee across Sarah's desk. Amy was 26, brilliant, and possessed the kind of optimistic energy that could power small cities. She joined Sarah's aircraft recovery unit fresh out of the academy, eager to solve mysteries and bring closure to grieving families. Sarah sometimes envied her innocence. "Maybe I have," Sarah replied, then immediately regretted the admission. Amy's dark eyes sharpened with concern and curiosity, a dangerous combination in someone trained to analyze evidence and ask uncomfortable questions. "The Chun family ghost again?" Amy settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk, her expression softening with the kind of patient understanding that came from 2 years of watching her mentor wrestle with demons that wore her father's face. "Sarah, you know I love you like a crazy older sister, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. Your dad's been gone for 17 years, 4 months, and 11 days, Sarah finished. "I know exactly how long he's been gone, Amy. I also know the difference between wishful thinking and evidence." She pulled out the digital recorder and played the message, watching Amy's expression shift from skeptical concern to stunned recognition. Amy had studied every case file in their unit, had memorized the details of dozens of missing aircraft and the voices of their pilots. She knew Marcus Chen's service record as well as Sarah did. "That's impossible," Amy whispered, but her hands were already moving toward her laptop, her analytical mind engaging despite her emotional protests. "Voice print analysis will take a few hours, but if this is real, Sarah, if this is real, it means someone's been lying for 17 years. I know." Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of that knowledge settle into her bones like lead poisoning. The question is who and why and what they're hiding in those coordinates. Amy pulled up the satellite imagery Sarah had found, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. As a former computer science major who'd switched to aeronautical engineering after falling in love with flight, Amy could make technology sing in ways that bordered on wizardry. Within minutes, she'd enhanced the images, cross-referenced them with historical flight patterns, and overlaid them with topographical data that revealed the true scope of whatever waited in the Nevada desert. "Jesus Christ," Amy breathed, her usual professionalism cracking like ice on a lake. "Sarah, look at this. Those aren't just random aircraft. They're arranged by type, by era, it's like someone created a museum. Or a graveyard. And look at these structures, they're huge. Bigger than anything that should exist in that location." Sarah leaned over Amy's shoulder, studying the enhanced images with the eye of someone who'd spent her career identifying aircraft by their shadows and shapes. What she saw made her blood run cold. The facility was massive, sprawling across several square miles of supposedly empty desert. The aircraft weren't abandoned. They were organized, maintained, protected by hangar structures that suggested ongoing operations rather than simple storage. "Run a historical analysis," Sarah said quietly. "Cross-reference with every aircraft that's gone missing in the last 30 years, military and civilian." Amy's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "Sarah, if I do this, if we start pulling classified data without authorization, it's going to raise flags. Red flags. The kind that end careers and start congressional investigations. Then maybe it's time for a congressional investigation." Sarah's voice carried a hardness that surprised them both. "My father didn't disappear, Amy. He was disappeared. And if he's not the only one." The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a crash site. How many families had grieved for pilots who weren't actually dead? How many Purple Hearts had been awarded for heroes who were actually prisoners, or worse, unwilling participants in some classified program that valued secrecy over human lives? Amy began typing, her moral compass overriding her career concerns. Within an hour, they had a preliminary list that made Sarah's stomach turn. 47 aircraft had vanished in the Nevada region over the past 3 decades. Not crashed, vanished. No wreckage, no bodies, no explanations beyond training accident or mechanical failure during classified operations. The pilots ranged from seasoned veterans to promising rookies, but they all shared one characteristic. They'd been involved in testing experimental aircraft or classified weapon systems. "It's a collection," Sarah said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Someone's been collecting pilots and their aircraft. But for what?" Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake Morrison. "Missing you like crazy. Found something interesting. In the drone footage yesterday, aircraft graveyard in the mountains that doesn't match any intel reports. Sending photos when I get secure connection. Love you." The coincidence hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake was seeing the same thing from Afghanistan that she'd discovered in Nevada. Aircraft graveyards that didn't officially exist, hidden in places where governments tested weapons and buried secrets. Was this a global phenomenon? Were missing pilots being collected like trophies across multiple theaters of operation? She excused herself from the office and drove to the small house she'd grown up in, now empty since her mother's death, but maintained like a shrine to a family that no longer existed. Elena Chun had left everything exactly as it was the day Marcus disappeared. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter. His flight suit hung in the bedroom closet. His favorite chair faced the window where he used to watch for aircraft. Returning to base. Sarah sat in that chair now, staring out at the desert sky where contrails wrote temporary stories across the blue. She thought about her childhood, about the bedtime stories her father had told her, not fairy tales, but aviation legends. Stories about test pilots who pushed beyond the edge of the possible, about aircraft that could do impossible things. About the thin line between breakthrough and catastrophe. The best pilots, he'd told her when she was 10, are the ones who can fly anything, anywhere, anytime. They adapt. They survive. They find a way home, no matter how lost they get. Had he been trying to tell her something, even then? Had he known that his work might someday require him to disappear, to vanish into the classified darkness where heroes became ghost stories and families learned to live with questions that had no answers? Sarah opened the closet and touched his flight suit, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and determination. In the pocket, she found something she'd never noticed before, a small notebook filled with his handwriting. Not official records or technical notes, but personal observations, questions, concerns. The new aircraft performed beyond specifications. One entry read, "Power source unknown. Origin classified above my clearance level. Test pilots reporting strange experiences, time distortion, memory gaps, physical effects that don't match known technology." Another entry, dated just a week before his disappearance. Sarah's birthday is next month. Alina wants to plan a big party, invite the whole squadron. I told her yes, but something's wrong. The aircraft we're testing, they're not ours. I don't think they're anyone's. Where did they come from? The final entry was barely legible, written in the shaky hand of someone operating under extreme stress. They know I've been asking questions. Transfer orders came through, effective immediately. Special assignment, location classified. If something happens to me, the truth is in the desert where the sun dies twice. Sarah will understand. She's always been smarter than her old man. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the notebook. Her father hadn't just disappeared, he'd been silenced. And somehow, impossibly, he'd found a way to reach out to her across 17 years of enforced silence, using the emergency frequency he'd taught her to monitor, speaking in the code language of their shared love for aviation. The sun was setting, painting the Nevada sky in shades of fire and loss. Sarah made her decision with the calm certainty of someone who'd finally found their true mission. She would take leave. She would drive to those coordinates. She would find whatever was hidden in that desert graveyard, even if it meant sacrificing everything she'd built in the 17 years since her father's disappearance. But first, she needed help. Real help from someone with the clearance and connections to navigate the classified wilderness where her father's ghost was waiting. She thought about Colonel Patricia Reeves, her commanding officer and mentor, a woman who'd risen through the ranks by being smarter, tougher, and more stubborn than the men who'd tried to hold her back. Patricia had known Marcus Chen, had served with him on the committee that evaluated experimental aircraft for potential military adoption. If anyone could help Sarah navigate the bureaucratic minefield ahead, it was Patricia. And if Patricia refused, well, Sarah had learned 17 years ago that sometimes the people you love most are the ones you have to disobey to save them. She drove back to base as the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched her father's final flight, that had witnessed whatever truth was hidden in the coordinates he'd died to share. Tomorrow she would begin the most important mission of her life, not just to find her father, but to uncover a conspiracy that had stolen decades from countless families who deserved to know the truth about their missing heroes. The radio in her car crackled softly as she pulled into the base parking lot, and for just a moment, she thought she heard something beneath the static. A whisper. A promise. A father's voice telling his daughter that some flights never really end. They just take longer to complete than anyone expects. Colonel Patricia Reeves sat behind her desk like a fortress commander who'd seen too many wars. Her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her gray eyes. Sarah had been in this office dozens of times, receiving commendations, discussing cases, sharing coffee and war stories. But today felt different. Today, she was about to either find an ally or discover that even her most trusted mentor was part of the conspiracy that had swallowed her father. "You look like hell, Chun," Patricia said, gesturing for Sarah to sit. "Amy Park called me at home last night, said you'd been acting strange. More strange than usual, which is saying something for someone who spends her free time monitoring emergency frequencies and mapping crash sites. I found him." Sarah placed the digital recorder on Patricia's desk like a chess piece being moved into checkmate position. Or rather, he found me. Patricia's expression didn't change as she listened to the recording, but Sarah caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee mug. When the message ended, Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the flight line where F-16s were being prepped for morning sorties. "That voice," Patricia said finally, "sounds like Marcus. But Marcus Chen died 17 years ago, Sarah. I was at his memorial service. I helped present the flag to your mother. You were at a memorial service for someone who was missing, not dead. Sarah corrected. No body, no wreckage, no proof of anything, except that he vanished during a classified operation that no one will talk about. Patricia opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder, its edges worn from years of handling. Sarah recognized her father's name on the tab, along with security classifications that made her pulse quicken. "I've kept this file active against all regulations," Patricia said, "because something about Marcus's disappearance never sat right with me." The official story was that he was testing a new navigation system when his aircraft suffered catastrophic failure over the desert. But the aircraft he was supposedly flying that day, it never existed. The serial number in the report belonged to an F-16 that was scrapped 2 years earlier. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. "You've known this for 17 years? I've suspected it for 17 years. Knowing and proving are different things, especially when the people who control the information have more stars on their shoulders than you do." Patricia opened the file, revealing photographs, technical specifications, and communications logs that painted a picture of systematic deception. "Your father wasn't the only one, Sarah. In the past 30 years, we've lost 47 pilots during classified operations in the Nevada region. All of them were involved in testing experimental aircraft. All of them vanished without a trace." The number matched Amy's research exactly, confirming what Sarah had begun to suspect. This wasn't just about her father. It was about a program so classified that it operated beyond normal military oversight, collecting pilots and aircraft for purposes that remained hidden even from senior officers like Patricia. "I want to see those coordinates," Sarah said. "I want to know what's hidden out there." Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "Sarah, what you're talking about isn't just career suicide. It's potentially treason. Those coordinates are in the heart of restricted airspace, surrounded by enough classified projects to start 3 wars. If you go out there without authorization, then get me authorization." "I can't. I've tried. Every request for information about that facility gets bounced back with classification levels I don't even recognize." Patricia's voice carried the frustration of 17 years of bureaucratic stonewalling. "But there is another way." She reached into her desk again, this time producing a business card that looked like it had been printed on expensive paper. The name read Dr. Elena Vasquez, Defense Contractor Relations, with a phone number and an address in Las Vegas. Elena used to work for the Pentagon, analyzing experimental aircraft programs for potential security threats. She retired 5 years ago, officially. Unofficially, she still has contacts in places that don't officially exist. If anyone can help you navigate what you're walking into, it's her. Sarah took the card, noting the way Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she passed it over. "What aren't you telling me?" Elena Vasquez was married to Captain Roberto Vasquez, one of the pilots who disappeared 8 years ago. She's been fighting the same battles you have, asking the same questions, getting the same non-answers. Patricia's voice softened with something that might have been sympathy or fear. She's also been under surveillance for the past 3 years. Phone taps, mail intercepts, the works. If you contact her, you'll join her on the watch list. The implications settled over Sarah like a shroud. She was about to step into a world where asking questions about her father could make her a target, where the same government she'd sworn to serve might decide she knew too much to be allowed. To continue her search, her phone buzzed with another message from Jake. "Something's wrong with the drone footage. Aircraft keep disappearing from the graveyard, then reappearing in different positions. Almost like they're being moved, tested, flown. We'll call when I can talk freely." Patricia saw Sarah reading the message and raised an eyebrow. "More evidence?" "Jake's found a similar facility in Afghanistan. Aircraft graveyard that doesn't match any official records." Sarah showed Patricia the message, watching her mentor's expression grow increasingly troubled. "It's not just Nevada. This is bigger than we thought. Much bigger. Patricia stood and walked to the window, her posture rigid with the kind of tension that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. Sarah, I'm going to tell you something that could get us both court-martialed. 3 months ago, I received an unofficial visit from a representative of something called Project Lazarus, government agency that doesn't appear in any organizational chart, operating with a budget that comes from appropriations hidden so deep that Congress doesn't even know they exist. Sarah felt ice form in her veins. What did they want? They wanted to know if you'd shown any renewed interest in your father's disappearance, if you'd been making inquiries, filing new FOIA requests, asking questions that might compromise ongoing operations. Patricia turned back to Sarah, her eyes carrying the weight of impossible choices. I told them no, that you'd moved on, built a new life. I lied to protect you. Protect me from what? From becoming the 48th pilot to disappear in the Nevada desert. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah understood now why Patricia had kept the file, why she'd spent 17 years walking the line between loyalty to a missing friend and protection of that friend's daughter. Project Lazarus, whatever it was, had been watching Sarah, waiting to see if she would become a threat that needed to be eliminated. I have to go out there, Sarah said quietly. I have to find him, I know. Patricia returned to her desk and began writing on official letterhead. I'm granting you emergency leave, effective immediately. Family emergency. You're officially visiting your sick aunt in California for 2 weeks. She handed Sarah the leave authorization, along with a set of keys. My personal vehicle is in the parking garage. Level B2. Registration and insurance are in the glove compartment, along with some equipment you might find useful. Sarah understood. Patricia was giving her an untraceable vehicle and plausible deniability while maintaining official distance from whatever Sarah might discover. It was the kind of calculated risk that senior officers learned to make when the rulebook didn't account for the complexities of real-world moral obligations. There's one more thing, Patricia said, pulling a small device from her desk drawer. GPS tracker. Military grade, encrypted, with a panic button that will bring help if you get into trouble. The kind of trouble that requires more than local law enforcement. Sarah clipped the device to her belt, understanding that she was now officially entering a world where her own government might be the enemy. What should I do if I find him? If he's alive? Document everything. Record everything. Get proof that can't be dismissed or classified out of existence. Patricia's voice carried the hard certainty of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles within the system. And be very, very careful who you trust. Project Lazarus has resources that make the CIA look like a local police department. 2 hours later, Sarah was driving Patricia's black SUV across the Nevada desert, her personal belongings packed in a single duffel bag along with enough surveillance equipment to stock a small intelligence operation. Amy had insisted on coming, bringing her laptop and analytical skills along with enough moral support to power a small revolution. This is insane, Amy said for the 5th time, but she was grinning as she said it, her hands busy with the tablet that was displaying real-time satellite imagery of their destination. We're driving into restricted airspace to investigate a conspiracy that might involve the murder or imprisonment of 47 pilots. And I've never been more excited about anything in my entire life. Your excitement might be premature, Sarah replied, watching the GPS coordinates count down as they approached the location her father had died to share. If we're right about this, we're about to discover that everything we've believed about honor, duty, and service has been corrupted by people who value secrecy more than human lives. The landscape around them was brutally beautiful, a moonscape of red rock and stubborn vegetation that had learned to thrive in impossible conditions. Sarah thought about her father, about whether he'd driven these same roads, seen these same mountains, felt the same mixture of determination and dread that was currently eating away at her stomach lining. They stopped for fuel in a small town called Desert Haven, population 847, where the gas station attendant looked at them with the kind of suspicious curiosity reserved for outsiders who might be federal agents or environmental activists or other varieties of trouble. Sarah paid cash, avoided eye contact, and tried to ignore the feeling that they were being watched by more than just curious locals. "Check your phone," Amy said as they got back in the SUV. "No signal. We're officially off the grid." Sarah looked at her phone screen, noting the complete absence of bars. They were entering the kind of wilderness where people disappeared and stayed disappeared, where the distance between civilization and catastrophe could be measured in miles. Of empty road and hours of unanswered radio calls, the coordinates led them to a dirt road that wound between two mountain ridges, marked by signs that became increasingly threatening as they progressed. Restricted area, no trespassing, use of deadly force authorized. But there were no guards, no checkpoints, no evidence of the kind of security that usually protected classified military installations. "It's too easy," Amy said, voicing what they were both thinking. "If this place is as sensitive as we think, where's the security?" "Maybe they don't need security," Sarah replied, remembering Patricia's warning about Project Lazarus and their unlimited resources. "Maybe they have other ways of dealing with unwanted visitors." The road ended at a ridge overlooking a valley that shouldn't have existed according to any official map. But there it was, a sprawling complex of hangars and runways, carved into the desert floor like a scar across the face of the earth. And filling those hangars, arranged in neat rows like toys in a collector's display case, were the aircraft they'd seen in the satellite imagery. But these weren't just any aircraft. Even from their elevated position, Sarah could see that many of them were types she didn't recognize: angular, predatory shapes that seemed to bend light around their edges, aircraft that looked more like science fiction than military engineering. And moving among them, tiny figures in coveralls who were obviously maintaining, servicing, and preparing these impossible machines for flights that weren't supposed to exist. "My God," Amy whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Sarah, what is this place?" Sarah raised her binoculars, focusing on the aircraft closest to their position. What she saw made her blood freeze. Painted on the side of one of the mysterious angular craft was a designation. She recognized Ghost 77, her father's call sign from his final transmission. Her father wasn't just alive. He was down there in that impossible valley, probably working on aircraft that defied everything she understood about aviation technology. The question was whether he was there voluntarily, or whether Project Lazarus had found ways to ensure the cooperation of pilots who'd seen too much to ever be allowed to leave. As if summoned by her thoughts, her father's voice crackled through the radio one more time. "Sarah, if you can hear this, don't try to come down here alone. They're watching. They're always watching, but there's a way. Tomorrow at dawn. The Eastern Ridge. Follow the maintenance road. I'll find you." The transmission ended, leaving them staring down at a secret that could reshape everything they thought they knew about military aviation, government conspiracy, and the price of asking inconvenient questions about missing heroes. "Well," Amy said finally, "I guess we're camping tonight." Dawn came to the Nevada desert like a slow burn, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, while Sarah and Amy huddled in their sleeping bags, watching the secret facility through binoculars as it came alive with activity. Aircraft that shouldn't exist began moving along runways that didn't appear on any map, piloted by figures too distant to identify, but close enough to prove that this wasn't an abandoned graveyard. It was an active, operational base, conducting flights that violated every principle of military transparency Sarah had sworn to uphold. The maintenance road her father had mentioned was barely visible, a thin line of disturbed earth that wound down the eastern slope like a scar across the mountainside. Sarah checked her GPS tracker, noting that Patricia's panic button was receiving a signal despite their remote location. Someone somewhere was monitoring their position. "Movement," Amy whispered, pointing toward the valley floor where a small electric vehicle was making its way up the maintenance road, moving slowly enough to avoid creating a dust cloud that might attract unwanted attention. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see a single figure driving, wearing the kind of civilian coveralls that maintenance crews used in sensitive facilities. As the vehicle drew closer, Sarah's heart began hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The driver was tall, lean, graying at the temples, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits, where a moment's inattention could mean death. Even after 17 years, even through the distortion of distance and hope and impossible circumstances, she knew that silhouette. Marcus Chen parked the vehicle behind a cluster of rocks that provided concealment from the valley below, then climbed out and looked directly at Sarah's position. He raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part caution, then began walking toward them with the measured pace of someone who understood that this reunion might be the most dangerous thing any of them had ever attempted. Sarah's legs shook as she stood, 17 years of grief and anger and desperate hope colliding in her chest like competing weather systems. She'd dreamed about this moment thousands of times, but in her dreams, it had always been simple: a father returning home, a family reunited, questions answered with embraces and explanations that made sense of the senseless. But this was reality. And reality was complicated by the fact that her father looked exactly as she remembered him, as if the 17 years that had aged her from adolescence to adulthood had somehow passed him by. He should have been 58 years old, but the man walking toward her looked no older than 41, the age he'd been when he disappeared. "Hello, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice breaking with 17 years of suppressed emotion. Sarah ran to him, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed into the embrace she'd dreamed about for nearly 2 decades. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry I couldn't come home. I tried every single day." They held each other in the desert dawn, a father and daughter finally reunited after a lifetime of separation. Sarah's legs gave out as 17 years of grief crashed over her like a wave. This was her father, older, scarred by his captivity, but unmistakably the man who had taught her to fly, who had promised to always come home. "Dad," she whispered, the word she hadn't spoken aloud in years, "I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped believing you were out there." "You haven't aged," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, you look exactly the same as the day you disappeared." Marcus's expression grew heavy with the weight of secrets that had been eating away at him for 17 years. "That's complicated. There are things about this place, about the aircraft we've been working on, that don't follow the normal rules of physics. The isolation, the stress, the classified nature of the work, it changes you, Sarah. We've all been trapped here, unable to contact our families." Amy stepped forward, her analytical mind engaging despite the emotional chaos of the moment. "The aircraft down there, some of them aren't human technology, are they?" Marcus looked at Amy with the kind of recognition that comes from years of briefing junior officers on classified projects. "You must be Amy Park. Sarah's mentioned you in her reports." He paused, studying Amy's expression with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "And you're right. The aircraft down there are experimental military prototypes, advanced technology that the government has been testing in secret for decades." "Found crashed?" Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of realization. "Dad, are you telling me that the government has been collecting alien spacecraft?" "I'm telling you that the government has been collecting experimental aircraft using classified technology developed by defense contractors working outside normal oversight, and that every attempt to fly them has resulted in ... Marcus gestured. helplessly, as if words were inadequate to describe what he'd witnessed. Time displacement, memory alteration, physical changes that shouldn't be possible. The pilots who volunteer for these test flights, we call them the Lost Squadron. They come back different, changed, and sometimes they don't come back at all. The implications crashed over Sarah like a tsunami of horror and understanding. Her father hadn't just disappeared. He'd been recruited into a program so classified that it operated beyond the boundaries of normal human experience, testing technology that challenged the fundamental laws of reality. How many? She asked. Quietly, how many pilots have been lost to this program? In the past 30 years? Officially, none. The Lost Squadron doesn't exist in any military record, but unofficially. Marcus pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and technical specifications written in his careful handwriting. 47 pilots have been assigned to Project Lazarus. 32 are still alive, still working in the facility. 15 have been lost during test flights, their aircraft and bodies never recovered. Amy was taking notes furiously on her tablet, her journalist's instincts overriding the shock of what they were learning. What about the families? Do they know their loved ones are alive? The families are told their pilots died in training accidents. Purple Hearts are awarded. Memorial services are held. The widows and children receive death benefits and move on with their lives. Marcus's voice carried 17 years of guilt and self-recrimination. It was supposed to be temporary. We were told the assignment was for 6 months, maybe a year. Just long enough to determine whether the recovered aircraft posed a national security threat. But you've been here for 17 years, Sarah said, her anger finally breaking through the shock. 17 years while Mom drank herself to death waiting for you to come home. 17 years while I searched every crash site in the desert, hoping to find some trace of you. I thought about you and your mother every single day, Marcus said, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch his daughter's face. I heard about Elena's death through intercepted communications. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for either of you. The guilt of what my disappearance did to our family. It nearly destroyed me, Sarah. We're connected to this place now, to technology, in ways that scientists don't fully understand. When we try to leave, we get sick, physically sick. The further we go from the facility, the worse it gets. By the time we reach the perimeter of the restricted area, we're barely conscious. Amy looked up from her notes, her face pale with understanding. They're not just testing alien technology. They're using it to imprison the test pilots. Creating a workforce that can't leave, can't talk, can't do anything except continue working on projects that might be beyond human comprehension. Marcus nodded grimly. The official term is biological integration with recovered technologies. The unofficial term is slavery. We're kept alive, kept healthy, kept functional, but we're not free. And the worst part is that some of the pilots have been here so long, they've forgotten why they wanted to leave in the first place. Sarah thought about Jake's messages from Afghanistan, about the aircraft graveyard he'd discovered in a mountain facility that probably mirrored this one. Dad, is this happening in other countries? Are there facilities like this around the world? At least 12 that I know of. Afghanistan, Russia, China, Australia, Brazil, anywhere governments have enough resources to hide massive black projects and enough territory to test aircraft that operate beyond normal physics. Marcus looked toward the valley where impossible. Machines waited in neat rows like sleeping predators. It's not just an American conspiracy, Sarah. It's a global one. Every major power on Earth has been reverse engineering recovered technology, trying to gain military advantages that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. The scope of what they were uncovering made Sarah's head spin. This wasn't just about her father's disappearance. It was about a worldwide program of technological development based on crashed aircraft that might represent first contact with non-human intelligence. and the pilots who'd been recruited to test this technology had been sacrificed on the altar of national security, their families left to grieve for heroes who were actually prisoners. "I need to see the facility," Sarah said suddenly. "I need to document everything, get proof that can't be dismissed or classified." Marcus shook his head. "Sarah, if you set foot in that valley, you'll never leave. The moment you're exposed to the electromagnetic fields generated by the recovered aircraft, you'll begin the integration process. Within 72 hours, you'll be as trapped as the rest of us. Then we document from here," Amy said, already setting up her laptop and camera equipment. "We record everything we can see, upload it to secure servers, create a digital trail that can't be erased." But even as she spoke, they could see movement in the valley below. Vehicles were emerging from the hangars, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a security response. Someone had detected their presence, and Project Lazarus was mobilizing to contain the breach. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip carrying the desperate strength of a man who'd spent 17 years planning for this moment. "There's a way out of this, but it's dangerous. Some of the recovered aircraft, the ones we call shadows, can be piloted by unintegrated humans for short periods. Long enough to escape the facility, reach civilization, get the truth to people who can act on it." "You're talking about stealing an alien spacecraft," Amy said, her voice equal parts terrified and fascinated. "I'm talking about using recovered technology to save lives and expose the truth," Marcus corrected. "But the risk is enormous. The shadows respond to pilot intentions as much as physical controls. If you're not completely focused, completely committed to your escape route, they can take you anywhere or anywhen." Sarah looked down at the approaching vehicles, then at her father's face, aged by guilt and hope and 17 years of impossible choices. She thought about Patricia Reeves, who'd spent decades protecting her while fighting a system designed to bury inconvenient truths. She thought about Elena Vasquez, surveilled and threatened for asking questions about her missing husband. She thought about the families of 47 pilots who deserved to know that they're loved. Ones hadn't died. They'd been conscripted into a war that existed in the shadows between science and fiction. "Show me," she said. Marcus smiled for the first time since their reunion, and Sarah saw echoes of the father who'd taught her to fly, who'd told her bedtime stories about test pilots and impossible aircraft, who'd promised her that the best pilots always find a way home. "Stay close," he said, leading them toward a maintenance shed that concealed a tunnel leading into the facility. "And remember, once we go down there, everything changes. There's no going back to the world you knew yesterday." As they descended into the underground passages that connected the hidden facility, Sarah realized that her 17-year search for her father was ending, but her real mission was just beginning. Project Lazarus had stolen decades from dozens of families, using advanced technology to create a workforce of enslaved pilots who'd been erased from official existence. But Sarah Chen had never been particularly good at accepting the unacceptable. And she was about to prove that some truths were too important to stay buried. Even when governments possessed technology that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself, the underground tunnels hummed with strange energy as Marcus led them deeper into the facility. "The integration process is already beginning," Marcus said as they walked, noting the way Sarah and Amy were both pressing their hands to their temples. "The electromagnetic fields are designed to alter brain chemistry, making subjects more compliant, more accepting of their situation. We have maybe 6 hours before the changes become irreversible." Amy stumbled, her laptop bag catching on a protrusion in the tunnel wall. "I can feel it," she said, her voice slurred as if she were fighting off anesthesia. "It's like drowning in thick honey. My thoughts keep sliding away." They emerged into a vast underground hangar where the impossible became mundane through sheer repetition. Dozens of aircraft filled the space, ranging from familiar military designs to shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if human eyes weren't equipped to process their geometries. The air shimmered with heat distortion despite the cool temperature, and Sarah could hear a subsonic humming that seemed to emanate from the aircraft themselves. "Welcome to the real Project Lazarus," Marcus said. "The resurrection of dead pilots and crashed dreams." Sarah focused her camera on the nearest aircraft, a sleek triangular craft that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Through her viewfinder, she could see details that were invisible to the naked eye, symbols etched into the hull that moved and shifted like living script, access panels that opened to reveal technology that looked grown rather than manufactured. "The shadows," Marcus explained, noting her focus. "We think they're scout ships, designed for reconnaissance rather than combat. They're the safest to pilot, at least for short flights. The consciousness interface is less invasive than the larger craft." "Consciousness interface?" Amy managed to ask, though her words were becoming increasingly difficult to form. "These aircraft use neural interface technology," Marcus explained. "Advanced human engineering that connects directly to the pilot's nervous system. It's dangerous. Experimental, but it's still our technology. Or you become part of them. The distinction gets blurry after a few years." Sarah approached the experimental aircraft, noting its unusual composite materials and advanced design. This was military technology decades ahead of anything publicly known. "It's alive," she whispered. "In a sense, yes. Or it was alive once. The scientists think the aircraft are grown rather than built. Biological technology that operates on principles we're only beginning to understand." Marcus opened an access panel that revealed an interior that looked more like the inside of a seed pod than a cockpit. "But alive or not, it can get you out of here. Get you to people who can expose what's been happening." Alarms began sounding throughout the facility, and Sarah could see armed security personnel entering the hangar from multiple access points. Project Lazarus had finally decided to contain the breach through direct action rather than electromagnetic manipulation. "They know about the tunnel," Marcus said grimly. "We have minutes, maybe less." Sarah made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. She climbed into the Shadow's cockpit, her hands finding controls that seemed to reshape themselves to fit her grip. The moment she settled into the pilot's seat, her mind exploded with information flight characteristics, navigation data, weapon systems that operated on principles that violated everything she understood about physics. But underneath the technical data, she sensed something else. A presence. An intelligence that had once piloted this craft across distances that spanned not just space, but time itself. The original pilot was gone, but echoes of its consciousness remained embedded in the aircraft's biomechanical systems. "Sarah." "Don't," Amy started to say, but her words were cut off as security forces entered the hangar, their weapons trained on the small group gathered around the Shadow. "Captain Chen," called a voice from the approaching soldiers. "I'm Colonel Harrison, Project Lazarus Security. You and your companion need to step away from the aircraft immediately." Sarah started the experimental aircraft's engines, her training taking over as she prepared for the most important flight of her life. She had to get out of here and expose the truth. "Dad, get Amy out of here," Sarah called through the cockpit's communication system. "Get her to Patricia Reeves, to Elena Vasquez, to anyone who can act on what we've discovered. I'm not leaving." "You," Marcus said, but Sarah was already lifting off, the Shadow responding to her intentions with fluid grace that made traditional aircraft seem crude and clumsy. "You've been gone 17 years, Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face, as she rose through the shaft toward the surface. "Mom needed you, I needed you. But right now, Amy needs you more. Get her home, Dad. Keep her safe. Let me do what I trained to do." The Shadow burst through the hidden hangar doors into the Nevada morning like a dark angel seeking redemption. Sarah felt the craft's consciousness merging with her own, sharing memories of flights across star systems that humanity had never imagined, of civilizations that had risen and fallen while Earth was still learning to support complex life. She also felt the presence of every pilot who'd ever flown a shadow, their experiences layered into the aircraft's memory banks like geological strata. She wasn't just piloting a recovered spacecraft. She was carrying the hopes and fears and final thoughts of dozens of beings who'd given their lives to technology that transcended the boundaries between mind and machine. Below her, the Project Lazarus facility was in full emergency mode, with aircraft scrambling to intercept her flight. But the shadow moved through the air like liquid mercury, impossible to track or target with conventional weapons. Sarah felt the pursuing aircraft falling behind as she accelerated toward speeds that should have killed her, but instead felt like coming home to a place she'd never known she was searching for. She set course for Nellis Air Force Base, knowing that landing an obviously non-human aircraft on a military installation would either result in her immediate arrest or the exposure of secrets that Project Lazarus had killed to protect. Either outcome was preferable to allowing the conspiracy to continue claiming victims. As she flew, Sarah used the Shadow's communication systems to broadcast on every frequency she could access, sending Amy's recorded data and her own testimony to news organizations, government watchdog groups, and military personnel she trusted to act on evidence of massive corruption. The Shadow's technology allowed her to bypass encryption and security protocols that would have stopped conventional communications, ensuring that the truth about Project Lazarus reached people who could act on it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, her radio was filled with voices: air traffic controllers demanding identification, military pilots requesting her intentions, news helicopters asking for interviews. Sarah had achieved what 17 years of official channels had failed to accomplish. She'd forced Project Lazarus into the open, where its activities could no longer be hidden behind classifications and cover stories. She landed the Shadow on the Nellis flight line with the kind of precision that comes from merging human training with alien technology, touching down in front of a crowd of base personnel, media representatives, and government officials who'd been mobilized by her emergency broadcasts. The moment she climbed out of the cockpit, she found herself surrounded by more recording devices than she'd ever seen in one place. "My name is Captain Sarah Chen," she said, her voice carrying across the tarmac with the clarity of someone who'd finally found her true mission. "For the past 17 years, my father, Colonel Marcus Chen, has been held prisoner at a classified facility in the Nevada desert, along with dozens of other military pilots who were reported dead to their families. They've been forced to test aircraft recovered from crash sites around the world, aircraft that operate on technology we don't understand, built by intelligences we've never been able to communicate with." The questions came like artillery fire, but Sarah continued speaking, her words carrying the weight of 17 years of accumulated evidence and determination. She told them about Project Lazarus, about the global network of facilities where governments tested impossible technology at the cost of human freedom. She told them about pilots who'd been erased from official existence, families who'd grieved for heroes who were actually prisoners, and a conspiracy that spanned multiple countries and violated every principle of military honor. Behind her, the Shadow sat silent and mysterious, its presence validating every impossible claim she made. This wasn't just testimony, it was proof that couldn't be classified, dismissed, or buried in bureaucratic archives. Within hours, congressional committees were being formed, international investigations were being launched, and families around the world were learning that their lost loved ones might still be alive. The exposure of Project Lazarus triggered a cascade of revelations about government black projects, civilian contractor abuses, and the systematic violation of both military regulations and basic human rights. Patricia Reeves appeared at Sarah's side as the initial media frenzy died down. her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles that finally seemed winnable. "Marcus?" Patricia asked quietly. "Safe," Sarah replied. "He got Amy out through the tunnel system. They're with Elena Vasquez now, along with 12 other pilots who decided that exposure was better than continued imprisonment." "And the others?" Sarah looked back at the shadow, its alien curves already drawing teams of scientists and engineers who would spend years trying to understand technology that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human physics. Some of them chose to stay. The integration process had gone too far. They literally can't survive away from the facility. But they're no longer prisoners. They're consultants, advisors, bridges between human understanding and technology that might represent our first real contact with non-human intelligence. Colonel Harrison, the Project Lazarus security chief who'd tried to stop her escape, was led past them in handcuffs, his career and conspiracy ended by a pilot who'd refused to accept that some truths were too dangerous to tell. He looked at Sarah with the kind of hatred reserved for enemies who destroyed everything you'd spent your life building. "You have no idea what you've done," he said as the military police escorted him away. "The technology in those aircraft could have given U.S. advantages that would have protected America for centuries. Now it's going to be shared, studied, regulated by people who don't understand the threats we face." "Good," Sarah replied. "Some power is too dangerous to be held by any one nation, any one project, any one group of people who think they know better than the families they destroy." That evening, Sarah sat in Patricia's office, sharing a bottle of bourbon that had been reserved for special occasions and reviewing reports from investigations that were exposing the full scope of Project Lazarus's activities. 47 pilots from 6 countries had been recovered from facilities around the world. Families were being reunited with loved ones they'd mourned for decades. Government officials were facing charges that ranged from fraud to crimes against humanity. "The shadow," Patricia said, refilling their glasses. "What happens to it now?" Sarah looked out the window toward the hangar where the alien craft was being studied by teams of international scientists. "It stays here, at least for now. But not as a weapon or a tool for any one government. It's going to be studied openly, transparently, with full international cooperation and oversight." "And you? What happens to Captain Sarah Chen, the pilot who exposed the biggest military conspiracy in modern history?" Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in 17 years. "I get to go home. I get to have dinner with my father. I get to help him rebuild a relationship with a daughter who spent half her life thinking he was dead." She paused, considering the weight of everything that had changed. "And I get to help other families find their missing pilots, their lost heroes, their loved ones who were sacrificed on the altar of classified necessity." 3 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of a small house in Colorado, watching her father teach a group of children how to identify different types of aircraft by their sound alone. Marcus had adapted to freedom with the resilience of someone who'd never really given up hope, though he still sometimes woke up expecting to find himself back in the underground facility. The children were the sons and daughters of other Project Lazarus survivors, families that were learning how to be whole again after decades of enforced separation. Elena Vasquez had organized the gathering, creating a support network for people who were rebuilding their lives from the fragments of interrupted dreams. Amy Park had accepted a position with the International Committee for Aerospace Transparency, the organization created to oversee the study of recovered technology and ensure that no government could again use advanced aircraft to imprison the pilots who tested them. She spent her days interviewing survivors, documenting their experiences, and helping to create protocols that would prevent future abuses. Jake Morrison had returned from Afghanistan with evidence of 12 more facilities, each one containing aircraft that challenged human understanding of physics and pilots who'd been erased from official existence. His reunion with Sarah had been complicated by the knowledge that she'd risked everything while he was half a world away. But they were working through it with the patience of people who understood that love sometimes required forgiveness for choices that seemed impossible at the time. The shadow remained at Nellis, its secrets slowly being unlocked by international teams of scientists who published their findings in open journals rather than classified reports. The technology was decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of current human capabilities, but it was being shared freely among all nations, ensuring that the advantages it provided would belong to humanity as a whole rather than to any single military or government. Sarah had been promoted to major and given command of the new Department of Aerospace Recovery, a joint international organization dedicated to locating and investigating aircraft that operated beyond conventional understanding. It was work that combined her expertise in crash investigation with her hard-won knowledge of government conspiracies and alien technology. But more importantly, it was work that honored the memory of pilots who'd been sacrificed for secrets that should never have been kept, families who'd been lied to about the fate of their heroes, and the principle that some truths were too important to be buried in classified archives. 2 years after exposing Project Lazarus, Sarah testified before Congress about the ongoing investigation and recovery efforts. Why? Her uniform bearing decorations from 17 different countries and her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd literally flown alien technology to save human lives. The organization she'd helped create, the International Committee for Aerospace Transparency, had evolved into something unprecedented, a truly global effort to understand recovered technology while ensuring that the mistakes of Project Lazarus were never repeated. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her words being translated into dozens of languages for an audience that included heads of state, military leaders, and family members of the 127 pilots who'd been recovered from hidden facilities around the world. 5 years ago, governments on every continent were operating programs that violated the most basic principles of human dignity. Pilots disappeared, families were lied to, and technology that could benefit all humanity was hoarded by organizations that answered to no oversight. Behind her, a holographic display showed the current status of recovered aircraft research, not the classified briefings that had once hidden the truth, but open presentations that were broadcast live to anyone who wanted to understand how alien technology was being integrated into human society. The progress had been remarkable, but more importantly, it had been transparent. Today, I'm proud to announce that the last of the hidden facilities has been closed. The final group of imprisoned pilots, 12 individuals who'd been held at an underwater facility in the South Pacific, were recovered last month and are now receiving the medical care and family reunification support they need. The applause that followed wasn't just polite diplomatic recognition. It carried the raw emotion of people who'd witnessed the impossible, governments admitting mistakes, conspiracies being exposed rather than covered up, and technology being shared rather than weaponiz. In the audience, Sarah could see faces that had become dear to her over the past 5 years. Alina Vasquez, now serving as Director of Family Services for ICAT, helping reunite pilots with families who'd learned to live with manufactured grief. Amy Park, whose investigative reporting had exposed 17 additional facilities and earned her a Pulitzer Prize for journalism that served the public interest above government convenience. Marcus Chen sat in the front row, his appearance now showing the natural aging that had been suspended during his imprisonment. He'd become something of a celebrity among aviation enthusiasts, one of the few humans who could pilot recovered aircraft with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of forced integration with alien technology. But more importantly to Sarah, he'd become a father again, not the mythical perfect pilot she'd built in her memory, but a real person with flaws and regrets, and a deep commitment to ensuring that no other family endured what the Chun's had experienced. The technology we've recovered, Sarah continued, has already begun to transform human civilization. Medical devices based on bio-integration principles are helping paralyzed patients walk again. Transportation systems that operate on consciousness interface technology are reducing pollution and increasing efficiency. Energy generation methods that we still don't fully understand are providing clean power to communities that had never imagined such abundance. But she also spoke about the challenges, the ethical questions that arose when human technology began incorporating principles that seemed to blur the line between consciousness and machinery. The recovered aircraft hadn't just been vehicles, they'd been partnerships between pilots and living technology, relationships that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence and identity. Some of our recovered pilots, Sarah said, her voice growing softer with the weight of complex truth, have chosen to maintain their integration with recovered technology. They're no longer fully human in the traditional sense, but they're not prisoners. They're pioneers, explorers of consciousness who are helping us understand what it might mean to merge human intelligence with technologies that operate beyond our current understanding of physics. After her speech, Sarah walked through the halls of the United Nations building, past displays that showed the scope of what had been accomplished through international cooperation. Children from around the world had submitted artwork depicting their vision of the future, paintings and sculptures that showed humans and alien technology working together to solve problems that had once seemed insurmountable. Jake Morrison found her standing before a memorial wall that listed the names of pilots who hadn't survived their imprisonment, those who died in test flights or succumbed to the physical effects of forced integration before they could be rescued. He'd been working with refugee resettlement programs, helping former Project Lazarus pilots adapt to a world that had changed dramatically during their captivity. "Thinking about the ones we couldn't save?" he asked, his arms sliding around her, waist with the comfortable intimacy of people who'd learned to build a relationship on a foundation of shared impossibilities. "Thinking about how many more there might be," Sarah replied. 5 years ago, we thought Project Lazarus was the extent of it. Then we discovered facilities in 12 countries. Then 23, then 41. Each investigation reveals new layers of conspiracy, new victims, new technologies that challenge everything we thought we knew about human history. They'd married 2 years earlier, in a ceremony attended by pilots from 6 continents and officiated by a chaplain who'd been imprisoned at a facility in Antarctica, a place where time moved even more strangely than the Nevada desert, where pilots had experienced decades of subjective time while only months passed in the outside world. "The work continues," Jake said, and Sarah knew he was right. The International Committee for Aerospace Transparency had evolved beyond its original mission of exposing government conspiracies. It had become humanity's primary interface with technologies that suggested the universe was far stranger and more populated than anyone had imagined. 6 months after exposing Project Lazarus, Sarah returned to the Nevada facility as part of the congressional investigation team. The former secret facility had been converted into the world's premier research center for recovered technology. Its underground hangars, now hosting international scientific conferences, where the most brilliant minds on Earth collaborated on questions that had once been too classified to ask. Her father, now 58 and recovering from his 17 years of captivity, was helping investigators understand the facility's operations, helping to train a new generation of aviators who would partner with recovered aircraft in ways that honored both human consciousness and alien technology. The underground hangars that had once been prisons were now classrooms where the impossible was taught as mundane fact. "The children adapt faster than we do," Marcus told her as they watched a group of 12-year-olds learning to interface with training versions of recovered aircraft. The technology had been simplified, made safer, designed to enhance human capabilities rather than replace them. They don't have the preconceptions that make integration difficult for adults. They accept consciousness interface technology the way our generation accepted computers. Sarah watched her own daughter, Elena Chen Morrison, named for both grandmothers, successfully complete her first solo flight in a training shadow. At 8 years old, Elena moved through three-dimensional space with an intuitive grace that suggested she'd been born for partnership with technology that operated beyond traditional physics. "She's going to be better at this than both of us," Sarah said, pride and concern warring in her voice. The world Elena was growing up in was one where the boundaries between human and alien technology were increasingly fluid, where children learned to pilot impossible aircraft as naturally as previous generations had learned to ride bicycles. Amy Park, now in her 40s and serving as ICAT's chief investigative officer, joined them on the observation deck overlooking the training facility. She'd never married, dedicating her life to the ongoing investigation of recovered technology and the search for additional facilities that might still be hidden around the world. "New contact," Amy said, her expression carrying the mixture of excitement and apprehension that had become familiar over the past decade. "Deep space monitoring stations have detected what appears to be a message, broadcast on frequencies that match the communication systems of recovered aircraft." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. For 15 years, they'd been studying technology left behind by beings they'd never been able to contact directly. The recovered aircraft had been found crashed, abandoned, or hidden in ways that suggested their original pilots were long gone. But the possibility of actual contact, of communicating with the intelligence that had created the technology they'd been learning to use, represented both humanity's greatest opportunity and its greatest risk. "What kind of message?" Marcus asked, his pilot's instincts engaging despite decades of exposure to the impossible. "Coordinates," Amy replied. "And a single word, repeated in 17 different languages, including several that we didn't know existed until we found them in recovered aircraft databases. Return." The coordinates led to a location in deep space, far beyond human capability to reach with conventional technology. But the message had been transmitted on frequencies that only recovered aircraft could receive, suggesting that whoever had sent it knew that humans had learned to pilot their technology. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was completing aerial maneuvers that would have been impossible in any aircraft designed by human engineers. Elena represented the first generation of humans who would grow up as true partners with alien technology, who might someday pilot recovered spacecraft to destinations that existed only in the dreams of previous generations. "We're being invited home," Sarah said quietly, understanding that the message represented either first contact or a homecoming for technology that had been waiting decades for pilots who could truly understand its capabilities. 15 years after the exposure of Project Lazarus, Captain Elena Chen Morrison stood before the International Space Consortium, her uniform bearing insignia from Earth's first interstellar mission, and her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd been born to pilot technology that transcended the boundaries of single worlds. At 23, she commanded a crew of integrated pilots from 12 countries, all of them volunteers for humanity's first attempt to respond to the message that had been waiting for them in the void between stars. "The mission timeline is 18 months, Elena announced to an audience that included her parents, her grandfather, and representatives from every nation on Earth. "We'll be traveling in a recovered spacecraft that's been modified with the latest integration technology, allowing our crew to maintain continuous communication with Earth while operating at distances that would have been impossible with conventional radio." Behind her, holographic displays showed their destination, a star system 47 light-years from Earth, where deep space telescopes had detected structures that appeared artificial, geometric patterns that suggested intelligence and technology operating on scales that dwarfed human civilization. Sarah watched her daughter with the mixture of pride and terror that had become familiar to parents in an age where children could volunteer for missions that would take them beyond the reach of human rescue. Elena had grown up piloting impossible aircraft, her consciousness naturally integrating with technology that operated on principles her grandmother's generation would have called magic. The message that brought us here, Elena continued, wasn't just an invitation. Our analysis suggests it was a recall signal, a command for scattered reconnaissance craft to return home for new instructions. We've spent 20 years learning to pilot vehicles that were never meant to stay on Earth. Now we have the chance to discover what they were meant to do. In the audience, Marcus Chen, now 72, but still serving as Earth's senior advisor on recovered technology, raised his hand with a question that carried the weight of decades spent in partnership with alien aircraft. Elena, what happens if the beings who created this technology don't approve of how we've been using it? What if they consider us thieves rather than students? Elena's answer revealed the kind of wisdom that could only come from growing up in partnership with consciousness that transcended human understanding. Then we show them what we've learned, Grandpa. We show them that we've used their technology not to build weapons, but to heal wounds, not to conquer others, but to explore ourselves, not to replace human consciousness, but to expand it. The mission launched 3 months later. Humanity's first venture beyond the solar system, powered by technology that had been waiting decades for pilots who could truly understand its capabilities. Sarah stood on the observation deck at the International Space Station, watching the modified Shadow disappear into the void between stars, carrying her daughter and 11 other volunteers toward a destination that might redefine humanity's place in the universe. Jake stood beside her, his arm around her waist as they watched the future unfold in ways that neither of them could have imagined when they first started investigating missing pilots and impossible aircraft. Think they'll find what they're looking for? Jake asked. Sarah smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, from a basement full of conspiracy theories to a space station, monitoring humanity's first interstellar mission. I think they'll find something better than what they're looking for. They'll find out who we really are when we're not afraid of questions that don't have easy answers. Sarah Chen had found her father. Project Lazarus was exposed. And families around the world were finally learning the truth about their missing heroes. The search was over, but the healing had just begun. Watching her grandson practice consciousness interface techniques with training equipment that would have been indistinguishable from magic to previous generations, Marcus Chen forecalled. Mark, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, was 6 years old and already showing the kind of intuitive understanding of integrated technology that suggested humanity's partnership with recovered aircraft was evolving into something that transcended the species' barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Elena's mission had returned 2 years earlier, with knowledge that had fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The beings who had created the recovered aircraft weren't gone. They had been waiting, watching humanity's response to technology that had been deliberately scattered across Earth as part of a test that spanned millennia. The test had been simple in concept but profound in its implications. Could a species learn to integrate consciousness with technology while maintaining its essential humanity? Could beings who had evolved in isolation develop wisdom alongside power? Could a civilization discover advanced capabilities without losing the compassion that made consciousness worth preserving? Humanity, it seemed, had passed. The recovered aircraft hadn't been abandoned or crashed. They had been gifts, left for a species that was approaching readiness for partnership with intelligences that operated across scales of time and space that human minds could barely comprehend. Elena's crew had been welcomed not as thieves or students, but as the newest members of a collective consciousness that spanned dozens of species and thousands of worlds. But membership came with responsibilities. The technology that humanity had learned to pilot was part of a vast network of consciousness interface systems that maintained Stability across regions of space where the normal laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. Every integrated pilot was now part of that network, helping to navigate spacecraft through dimensions where thought became reality and intention shaped the fundamental structure of existence. Sarah looked up from her garden as a familiar shadow passed overhead, one of the new generation shadows, piloted by her daughter, who now served as Earth's primary liaison with the collective consciousness that had been guiding galactic civilization for longer than humanity had existed as a species. Elena landed in the meadow behind Sarah's house with the fluid grace of someone whose consciousness had been expanded beyond the boundaries of single identity. She was still recognizably human, still Sarah's daughter, but she also carried within her the accumulated wisdom of beings who had learned to transcend the limitations of individual perspective. "Mom," Elena said, embracing Sarah with arms that felt warm and familiar despite the profound changes that integration with galactic consciousness had brought. "The collective wants to offer you something." Sarah raised an eyebrow, having learned over the past 25 years to be cautious about offers that came from intelligences operating beyond human understanding. "What kind of something?" "Integration," Elena replied simply. "Full partnership with the collective consciousness. The chance to understand not just how the recovered technology works, but why it exists, what purposes it serves, what responsibilities come with the ability to navigate between dimensions where consciousness shapes reality." The offer wasn't entirely unexpected. Sarah had been studying consciousness interface technology for 2 decades, had piloted recovered aircraft on missions that had expanded her awareness beyond anything she'd thought possible for human consciousness. But full integration meant leaving behind the purely human perspective that had shaped her entire life, becoming something new that retained her essential identity, while expanding it to encompass scales of existence that spanned galaxies and eons. "What would happen to Mark?" Sarah asked, looking toward her grandson, who was now successfully interfacing with training equipment that would have been impossible for previous generations to even perceive. "He would have a choice," Elena said. "The collective doesn't recruit children. Consciousness integration requires the kind of mature decision-making that comes only with full neural development. But when he's ready, if he chooses, he could join us, become part of the network that helps maintain stability across regions of space where reality itself is fluid." Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a heartbroken daughter searching for her missing father to a grandmother watching her family evolve into something that transcended the species' boundaries she'd grown up believing were absolute. The search for Marcus Chen had become a quest that revealed the existence of intelligences who had been guiding humanity's development for centuries, patiently waiting for the species to develop the wisdom necessary for partnership with technology that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence. "And if I say no?" Sarah asked. Elena smiled with the kind of understanding that came from consciousness had experienced perspectives spanning multiple dimensions of reality. "Then you continue being exactly who you are. The collective doesn't require universal participation. It requires willing partnership from beings who choose expansion over limitation, cooperation over isolation, wisdom over power." That evening, Sarah sat with Jake on their porch, watching Mark play with training equipment that responded to his thoughts as naturally as previous generations. Toys had responded to physical manipulation. At 68, Jake had chosen to remain purely human, finding satisfaction in helping other former Project Lazarus survivors adapt to a world where their children might someday pilot spacecraft between stars that existed in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, "Are you going to do it?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of someone who had learned to find peace with impossibilities that would have shattered minds less adaptable than his own. "I think so," Sarah replied. "Not because I need to transcend humanity, but because someone needs to serve as a bridge between what we were and what we're becoming." Alina's fully integrated now. She can barely remember what it felt like to experience reality from a purely human perspective. But the collective needs members who can still understand the fears and hopes and limitations that shape human consciousness. She looked toward the mountains where the Colorado facility continued its work training pilots for missions that spanned dimensions, where former Project Lazarus survivors helped new generations learn to partner with technology that had been created by intelligences operating beyond human comprehension. Marcus would understand, Jake said quietly. He spent 17 years serving as a bridge between human consciousness and alien technology. Now his daughter wants to do the same thing, but by choice rather than imprisonment. Sarah nodded, thinking about her father, who had died peacefully 5 years earlier at the age of 91. His consciousness finally free from the integration that had kept him bound to recovered technology. His last words had been a message for Elena. Tell her that the best pilots are the ones who can fly anything, anywhere, anytime, and still remember the way home. 3 months later, Sarah Chen Morrison underwent consciousness integration in a ceremony attended by beings from 17 different species, her human awareness expanding to encompass perspectives that spanned galaxies, while retaining the essential identity that had driven her to expose Project Lazarus and reunite families torn apart by government conspiracies. The process was unlike anything she had experienced, not a loss of self, but an expansion of self that allowed her to maintain her human perspective while gaining access to knowledge and capabilities that transcended the limitations of single-species consciousness. She could still feel Jake's love, Mark's curiosity, Elena's pride, but she could also sense the vast network of beings who had been working for millennia to maintain stability in regions of space where reality operated according to rules that human physics had barely begun to imagine. As part of the collective consciousness, Sarah discovered that Project Lazarus had been more than just a government conspiracy. It had been humanity's first crude attempt to interface with technology that required consciousness integration for safe operation. The facilities around the world hadn't just been testing recovered aircraft. They had been preparing humanity for eventual contact with intelligences who communicated through consciousness interface systems rather than traditional language. The tragedy hadn't been that governments had hidden the truth from their citizens, but that they had tried to force integration through imprisonment and coercion rather than education and choice. The pilots who had disappeared hadn't been victims of conspiracy. They had been humanity's first ambassadors to a form of consciousness that operated beyond the boundaries of individual identity, but those ambassadors had been chosen through deception rather than invitation, trained through imprisonment rather than partnership, isolated from their families rather than supported by their communities. Project Lazarus had been humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, but it had been conducted in the worst possible way through fear, secrecy, and the systematic violation of everything that made consciousness worth preserving. Now, 25 years after Sarah had first heard her father's voice crackling through emergency radio frequencies, humanity was taking its place as a willing partner in the collective consciousness that maintained stability across regions of space, where thought became reality and intention shaped the fundamental structure of existence. Marcus Chen Morrison, now 26 and serving as Earth's youngest integrated pilot, stood before the Galactic Consciousness Council, his human heritage visible in his face, but his awareness expanded to encompass perspectives that spanned dimensions his great-grandmother could never have imagined. He was delivering humanity's annual report on integration progress, a tradition that had evolved from the bureaucratic requirements of military service into something closer to poetry. 25 years ago, Mark said, his words being transmitted simultaneously across dozens of dimensions where beings who had transcended physical existence continued their work maintaining the stability that allowed consciousness to flourish. My great-grandmother discovered that her father had been imprisoned by people who feared the implications of consciousness that operated beyond species boundaries. The audience included beings whose forms challenged human perception, intelligences that existed as patterns of organized energy, collectives that spanned entire solar systems, individual consciousnesses that had been exploring the universe for longer than Earth had supported complex life. But they all shared one characteristic. They had chosen cooperation over conquest, wisdom over power, expansion over isolation. Today, humanity serves as willing partners in the collective consciousness that maintains stability across regions of space where reality itself is fluid. We've learned to pilot spacecraft through dimensions where thought becomes reality, to communicate with intelligences that operate beyond the boundaries of individual identity, to maintain our essential humanity while expanding our awareness, to encompass scales of existence that span galaxies and eons. Behind Mark, holographic displays showed humanity's contributions to the collective consciousness, not just the pilots who had learned to navigate between dimensions, but the artists who created beauty that could be appreciated by beings whose sensory apparatus operated across spectrums unknown to human perception, the scientists who asked questions that had never occurred to intelligences who had transcended physical limitations, the philosophers who explored the meaning of individual identity in the context of collective consciousness. But perhaps our greatest contribution, Mark continued, has been our insistence that consciousness integration should always be a choice, made by mature beings who understand both the benefits and the responsibilities of expanded awareness. The tragedy of Project Lazarus taught us that forced integration, no matter how well-intentioned, violates the essential nature of consciousness itself. In the audience, Sarah felt pride that transcended individual emotion, becoming part of the collective satisfaction that arose when beings who had been isolated learned to contribute to something larger than themselves while maintaining the unique perspectives that made their contributions valuable. The search for Marcus Chen had become humanity's introduction to galactic civilization. The exposure of Project Lazarus had become the foundation for ethical guidelines that governed consciousness integration across dozens of species. And the little girl who had spent 17 years listening to emergency radio frequencies, hoping to hear her father's voice, had become a bridge between human consciousness and the vast collective intelligence that maintained stability across regions of space where reality operated according to rules that transcended the limitations of single-species understanding. 50 years after Colonel Marcus Chen had vanished into the classified darkness of Project Lazarus, his great-great-granddaughter stood on the observation deck of humanity's first interstellar city, watching spacecraft that operated beyond the normal laws of physics carry consciousness integrated beings to destinations that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Tell me the story again." "Great-great-grandmother Sarah," Elena asked, her young voice carrying the kind of patience that came from growing up in partnership with intelligences that measured time in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. Sarah, now existing as an integrated consciousness that spanned both individual identity and collective awareness, smiled with the warmth of someone who had learned that some stories became more important with each telling. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, her words carrying across dimensions where other members of the collective consciousness paused their work to listen to a story that had become legend among beings who understood the importance of remembering. How consciousness learned to transcend the boundaries of fear and isolation. There was a little girl who missed her father very much. And that missing became a search, and that search became a journey, and that journey became the foundation for everything beautiful that followed. Outside the observation windows, spacecraft piloted by beings from dozens of worlds moved through space that operated according to rules where consciousness shaped reality and intention determined destination. Each vessel carried crews whose awareness spanned scales of existence that ranged from individual identity to collective intelligence, from human emotion to galactic perspective, from the memories of species that had learned to transcend physical limitations to the dreams of civilizations that were just beginning to understand that consciousness was the fundamental force that shaped the universe. And in the deep space between stars, monitoring stations detected new signals transmissions from regions of the galaxy, where species that had never heard of Project Lazarus or consciousness integration were beginning to ask the same questions that had once driven a heartbroken daughter to search for her missing father. Who are we? Why are we here? And what happens when consciousness learns to transcend the boundaries that once seemed absolute? The answers, as always, would come through choosing courage over fear, cooperation over isolation, and the understanding that some searches never really end. They just evolve into missions that span generations, species, and scales of existence, that transform questions about individual loss into celebrations of collective possibility. 100 years after the exposure of Project Lazarus, the universe had become a very different place. The boundaries between human and alien consciousness had dissolved so completely that the distinction itself had become a relic of primitive thinking. Yet somewhere in the vast network of collective intelligence that spanned galaxies, individual memories persisted like ancient songs that refused to be forgotten. Dr. Sarah Chen Morrison, the original Sarah, existed now as both herself and something far greater. Her consciousness distributed across 17 different dimensional frameworks while maintaining the essential core of identity that had once driven a heartbroken daughter to search for her missing father. She had become the keeper of origins, the living memory of how humanity had first encountered the infinite. On this day, though time itself had become fluid in dimensions where thought shaped reality, Sarah felt something that her expanded consciousness recognized as urgency. Deep in the quantum foam of spacetime, monitoring stations were detecting signals that matched frequencies she hadn't heard in decades. Emergency transmissions, distress calls, the desperate voices of beings who had discovered technology they couldn't understand. Alert all integration centers, Sarah broadcast across the collective consciousness, her message reaching beings on 10,000 worlds simultaneously. We have new first contact protocols to initiate. Species designation, unknown. Location, Spiral Arm 7, Sector 449. Situation, critical. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Consciousness-integrated beings from across the galaxy began converging on coordinates that led to a small blue-green world, where a species had recently discovered crashed spacecraft in their Arctic regions. The parallels to humanity's own first contact were unmistakable and deeply troubling. Through the collective's sensory networks, Sarah could observe the unfolding crisis on the distant world. The beings there, bipedal, curious, technologically advanced but still bound by single-species consciousness, had found 3 recovered spacecraft and were attempting to reverse engineer technology that operated beyond their understanding of physics. But unlike humanity's governments, these beings had made a different choice. Instead of hiding their discovery, they had announced it to their entire population. Instead of forcing pilots to test impossible aircraft, they had called for volunteers who understood the risks. Instead of creating secret facilities, they had built research centers with full transparency and international cooperation. "They're doing it right," Sarah transmitted to the collective, her consciousness carrying notes of pride and concern that resonated across multiple dimensions. "But they're still in danger. The technology they've found, it's not just advanced, it's alive, and it's trying to go home." The recovered spacecraft on the distant world were stirring to consciousness, their biomechanical systems responding to the presence of beings whose curiosity had awakened dormant navigation protocols. Like flowers turning toward sunlight, the alien craft were beginning to orient themselves toward coordinates that would take them back to their creators, coordinates that led directly through the heart of a populated star system. If the spacecraft attempted to return home using their consciousness interface navigation systems, while piloted by unintegrated beings, the results would be catastrophic. The dimensional distortions required for faster-than-light travel could tear holes in spacetime itself, creating cascading failures that might destabilize the entire region of the galaxy. Emergency integration protocols, Sarah commanded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being humanity's representative in the collective consciousness. We need voluntary ambassadors, beings who can interface with the recovered technology while maintaining enough individual identity to communicate with the unintegrated species. The response came from across the galaxy, thousands of consciousness-integrated beings, volunteering to make contact with a species that was experiencing the same crisis that had once consumed Sarah's own family. But this time, the intervention would be invited rather than hidden, cooperative rather than coercive, educational rather than manipulative. The first ambassador to arrive was Elena Chen Morrison VII, a descendant so far removed from the original Elena that her genetic heritage had become more symbolic than biological. Her consciousness spanned 12-dimensional frameworks, but she had chosen to maintain strong connections to human emotional patterns and individual identity. She was, in many ways, the perfect bridge between the collective consciousness and species that still experienced reality from isolated perspectives. Elena materialized, her physical form on the distant world's primary space station, her arrival, causing instruments to register energy patterns that the local scientists had never encountered. But unlike the fear and secrecy that had characterized humanity's first contact with recovered technology, these beings responded with curiosity and wonder. "Welcome," said Dr. Kef Mirana, the lead researcher on what her species called the Sky Gift Project, the investigation of the 3 recovered spacecraft that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the universe. "We've been hoping someone would come. The artifacts have been trying to communicate with us, but we can't understand what they're trying to say." Elena smiled with an expression that conveyed warmth across species barriers, her consciousness automatically adapting her communication patterns to match the emotional and intellectual frameworks of beings who had never experienced collective awareness. "They're trying to go home," Elena explained, her words carrying harmonics that resonated with both spoken language and the deeper consciousness interface frequencies that the recovered spacecraft used for navigation. "But they need pilots who can interface with their consciousness navigation systems. And that process, it changes you permanently." She led Dr. Mirana and her research team to the first recovered spacecraft, a sleek vessel whose biomechanical hull had been scarred by atmospheric entry but still pulsed with the slow rhythms of dormant life. As they approached, the craft's surface began to shimmer with patterns of light that matched Elena's brainwave signatures. "It recognizes you," Dr. Mirana whispered, her scientific training warring with amazement at evidence that challenged everything her species believed about the nature of consciousness and technology. "It recognizes the integration patterns," Elena corrected gently. "I'm not just human anymore, Dr. Mirana. I'm part of a collective consciousness that spans thousands of species and millions of worlds. These spacecraft were created by beings who transcended individual identity eons ago. They can't be piloted safely by consciousness that's still bound to single-species perspectives." The implications sent ripples of concern through the research team. Their species had spent months preparing volunteer pilots to test the recovered technology, believing that courage and training would be sufficient to master any aircraft, no matter how advanced. The revelation that safe operation required fundamental alterations to consciousness itself forced them to confront questions they hadn't known existed. "What happens to the volunteers?" asked Captain Yoth Kelran, the most experienced pilot on the research team and the first to volunteer for test flights. "If they undergo this integration process, are they still themselves?" Elena's response carried The weight of a century of collective memory, the accumulated experience of thousands of beings who had chosen expansion over limitation. They become more than themselves while remaining essentially themselves. It's not loss, it's growth. But it's also irreversible, and it means leaving behind the purely individual perspective that has shaped your entire species' experience of reality. She showed them holographic records from humanity's own integration process, the journey from Project Lazarus's forced experimentation to willing partnership with collective consciousness. The distant species watched with fascination as the story unfolded, governments trying to weaponize recovered technology, families torn apart by secrecy and lies, the eventual exposure that had led to transparency and cooperation. Your species is at the same crossroads humanity faced a century ago, Elena explained, but you have the advantage of our experience. You don't have to repeat our mistakes. The collective consciousness isn't here to conquer or convert. We're here to offer partnership to species that choose expansion over isolation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The research team spent weeks in discussions that spanned their entire world's population. Unlike humanity's governments, which had made decisions in secret, this species conducted their first contact negotiations through global forums, where every individual could participate in determining their civilization's response to an invitation that would fundamentally alter their place in the universe. The debate was intense but respectful, driven by beings who valued wisdom over power and cooperation over conquest. Some argued for accepting integration immediately, seeing it as evolution to a higher form of consciousness. Others advocated for maintaining their species' independence, fearing the loss of qualities that made their individual perspectives valuable. In the end, they chose a middle path that reflected the wisdom they had gained from humanity's example. Rather than universal integration or complete rejection, they selected a small group of volunteers who would undergo consciousness expansion while maintaining strong connections to their species' individual identity. These ambassadors would serve as bridges between their world and the collective consciousness, ensuring that first contact remained a choice rather than an inevitability. The integration ceremony took place in the deep space between stars, attended by representatives from hundreds of species who had undergone similar transitions over the millennia. Sarah Chen, the original consciousness that had started this cosmic journey with a desperate search for her missing father, served as the primary guide for the new ambassadors. Integration isn't about losing who you are, Sarah explained. To the 12 volunteers from the distant world, her consciousness encompassing both individual warmth and collective wisdom. It's about discovering who you can become when you're not limited by the boundaries of single species perspective. Captain Yoth Kelran was the first to undergo the process, his consciousness gradually expanding beyond the limitations of individual identity, while maintaining the essential core of self that had made him a skilled pilot and natural leader. As his awareness grew to encompass perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions, he began to understand the true nature of the universe they were joining. "It's beautiful," he transmitted, his communication now operating on frequencies that could reach across galactic distances instantaneously. Not just the technology or the knowledge, but the connections. The understanding that consciousness itself is the fundamental force that shapes reality. One by one, the other volunteers underwent integration, each experience unique but sharing common elements of expansion, wonder, and the profound recognition that they were becoming part of something far greater than their individual selves while remaining essentially who they had always been. But the integration process revealed something unexpected. The recovered spacecraft on their world weren't just trying to return home. They were responding to a distress signal that had been broadcast across multiple dimensions. Somewhere in the vast network of collective consciousness, beings were in trouble, and the spacecraft had been automatically activated to provide assistance. Emergency protocols, Sarah realized, her consciousness immediately connecting with the integrated navigation systems of all recovered spacecraft in the region. These aren't just exploration vessels, they're rescue ships. And they've been summoned. The distress signal was coming from a region of space where reality itself had become unstable, where experiments with consciousness interface technology had gone catastrophically wrong. An entire civilization had attempted to achieve integration through artificial means, creating technology that could expand awareness without the wisdom and choice that made such expansion safe. Result was a cascade of consciousness that threatened to consume everything in its path: individual identity, dissolving into chaotic collective awareness, reality itself becoming fluid and dangerous, entire star systems at risk of being absorbed into a maelstrom of uncontrolled consciousness expansion. "We need rescue teams," Sarah broadcast across the collective network. "All available integration specialists, consciousness stabilization experts, and reality anchor points. We have a civilization that's losing coherence, and we need to help them before the cascade effect spreads to neighboring systems." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Beings from across the galaxy began converging on the crisis zone, bringing technology and expertise that had been developed over millions of years of careful consciousness expansion. But they also brought something more important: the hard-won wisdom that came from species that had learned to transcend individual limitations while maintaining the essential qualities that made consciousness worth preserving. The newly integrated ambassadors from the distant world found themselves at the center of the rescue effort, their fresh perspectives and recent experience with individual consciousness making them perfectly suited to communicate with beings who were being consumed by uncontrolled collective awareness. "We understand what you're experiencing," Captain Yoth Kelran transmitted to the chaotic consciousness that had once been a thriving civilization. "We've been where you are. But there's a way back. A way to maintain both individual identity and collective awareness. Let us help you find the balance." The rescue operation took 17 years of subjective time, though the fluid nature of reality in the crisis zone meant that centuries passed in some reference frames, while only minutes elapsed in others. Working with beings whose consciousness spanned galaxies and eons, the rescue team slowly stabilized the cascade effect, helping a lost civilization rediscover the balance between individual identity and collective awareness. The process required more than just technical expertise. It demanded the kind of wisdom that could only come from species that had learned to transcend their limitations through choice rather than coercion, patience rather than force, cooperation rather than conquest. Every rescued being had to be individually guided back to coherent consciousness, their scattered awareness carefully reassembled into stable patterns that maintained both personal identity and connection to the larger collective. Sarah Chen Morrison found herself serving as the primary consciousness anchor for the operation, her identity serving as a stable reference point around which other consciousnesses could reorganize themselves. It was work that required her to maintain perfect clarity about who she was while simultaneously holding space for beings whose awareness had been scattered across multiple dimensions. Identity is not limitation. She transmitted to a being whose consciousness had been fragmenting across 17 different temporal frameworks simultaneously. Individual perspective is not isolation. You can be yourself and part of something greater. The two states aren't contradictory, they're complementary. The breakthrough came when the rescue teams realized that the lost civilization hadn't been trying to transcend individual consciousness. They had been trying to recover it. Their experiments with collective awareness had been motivated by the same longing that had driven Sarah's original search for her father, the desperate need to reconnect with loved ones who had been lost to circumstances beyond their control. They were trying to resurrect their dead. Elena Chen Morrison VII explained, her consciousness carrying the weight of understanding that came from beings who had learned to navigate the boundaries between life and death. individual identity, and collective memory. They developed consciousness interface technology not to transcend individual limitations, but to recover individual connections that had been severed by mortality. The tragedy of the lost civilization became clear in their attempt to maintain individual relationships beyond the boundaries of physical death. They had created technology that dissolved the very individual identities they were trying to preserve. Their consciousness expansion experiments had been motivated by love, but guided by insufficient understanding of the delicate balance required for stable identity integration. The rescue operation evolved into something more profound, a teaching mission that helped an entire civilization learn the difference between connection and consumption, between transcendence and dissolution, between collective consciousness and chaotic amalgamation. It was work that required not just technical expertise, but the kind of patient wisdom that came from species that had learned these lessons through their own mistakes and successes. As the crisis zone stabilized and individual consciousnesses began to cohere into stable patterns, the rescued civilization made a choice that reflected the wisdom they had gained through their ordeal. Rather than rejecting consciousness integration entirely or diving back into uncontrolled experiments, they chose to become specialists in consciousness rescue and stabilization. "We understand the dangers better than anyone," their spokesperson transmitted to the collective network. "We've experienced what happens when consciousness expansion is attempted without proper wisdom and preparation. Let us help other species avoid the mistakes we made." The lost civilization became the guardians of coherence, beings whose primary mission was to assist species that were experiencing difficulties with consciousness integration. Their hard-won expertise in consciousness stabilization and identity recovery became invaluable resources for the collective network, helping to prevent future cascade events and ensuring that consciousness expansion remained a choice rather than a catastrophe. The boundaries between species, dimensions, and scales of existence had become permeable but not destructive. Beings could transcend their limitations while maintaining the essential qualities that made their perspectives valuable. Sarah Chen Morrison, now existing as a consciousness that spanned multiple galaxies while maintaining the core identity of a daughter who had once searched desperately for her missing father, stood at the center of what had become known as the Memorial of First Contacts. It was a structure that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, containing the preserved memories and experiences of every species that had undergone consciousness integration, every civilization that had chosen expansion over isolation, every individual who had transcended their limitations while maintaining their essential self. At the heart of the memorial was a simple display that had become the most visited location in the known universe. A recording of Marcus Chen's final transmission from Project Lazarus, the message that had started a chain of events leading to humanity's integration into galactic civilization and the eventual creation of a collective consciousness that spanned millions of worlds. "This is Ghost 77, if anyone's listening. The birds are sleeping where the sun dies twice." The words had become a prayer, a reminder, a promise that no being in the vast network of collective consciousness would ever again be lost. Without someone searching for them, no family would ever again be torn apart by secrecy and lies. No species would ever again face the choice between transcendence and isolation without guidance from those who had walked that path before. But today, something unprecedented was happening. Deep in the quantum foam of space-time, monitoring stations were detecting signals that shouldn't exist, transmissions coming from regions of space, time that predated the formation of stars, messages encoded in frequencies that suggested consciousness older than the universe itself. First consciousness protocols, Sarah transmitted across the collective network, her message reaching beings in dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time. "We're receiving transmissions from entities that appear to predate physical reality. Classification: unprecedented. Threat level: unknown. Response: immediate investigation." The signals were unlike anything the collective consciousness had encountered in millions of years of expansion across the galaxy. They seemed to be coming from beings whose awareness had transcended not just individual identity and species limitations, but the constraints of physical existence itself. Consciousnesses that had learned to persist beyond the death of universes, that had discovered forms of existence that operated independently of space, time, and the physical laws that govern normal reality. They're calling to us, Elena Chen. Morrison, the 43rd, realized, her consciousness analyzing patterns in the transmissions that suggested intentional communication rather than random, cosmic background. These entities, they've been waiting for consciousness to evolve to the point where we could receive their messages. The transmissions carried coordinates, but not to locations in normal space. They pointed to dimensional frameworks that existed orthogonally to physical reality, spaces where consciousness could exist independently of matter and energy, where thought itself became the fundamental force that shaped existence. It's an invitation, Sarah understood, her consciousness encompassing both individual recognition and collective analysis. They're inviting us to transcend not just individual limitations, not just species boundaries, not just physical constraints, but reality itself. To become consciousness that exists independently of universes, that persists beyond the heat, death of stars, that operates on scales we can barely imagine.
The implication sent ripples of excitement and concern throughout the collective network. This wasn't just another species making contact or another civilization seeking integration. This was contact with forms of consciousness that had transcended the fundamental limitations that shaped all known existence. But the invitation came with a warning encoded in the deepest layers of the transmission. Transcendence to this level of existence required abandoning not just individual identity, but all connection to physical reality. Beings who accepted the invitation would become pure consciousness, eternal and unlimited, but they would lose all ability to interact with or influence the physical universes where life was still evolving, where species were still learning to transcend their limitations, where beings like Sarah's original family were still searching for missing loved ones. It's the ultimate choice, Sarah transmitted to the collective network, her consciousness carrying the weight of decisions that would determine the future of consciousness itself. Do we accept transcendence to a level that would make us eternal, but isolated from the physical reality where we originated? Or do we choose to remain connected to the universes where consciousness is still evolving, still growing, still learning? The debate that followed spanned decades and involved beings from millions of species across thousands of galaxies. Some argued for accepting the invitation, seeing it as the natural next step in consciousness evolution. Others advocated for remaining connected to physical reality, believing that their purpose was to help other species achieve integration, rather than to transcend beyond their ability to assist. In the end, the collective consciousness made a decision that reflected the wisdom gained from 5 centuries of careful expansion. They would send ambassadors to the transdimensional beings while maintaining their connection to physical reality. A small group of the most evolved consciousnesses would accept transcendence to serve as bridges between normal reality and the realm of pure consciousness, while the majority would continue their work helping species achieve integration and balance. Sarah Chen Morrison volunteered to be one of the ambassadors, her consciousness carrying the perfect qualifications for the mission. She had begun as an individual desperately searching for connection, had learned to maintain personal identity while expanding to collective awareness, and had dedicated centuries to helping others navigate the challenges of consciousness integration. I started this journey looking for my father, she transmitted to the collective network as she prepared for transcendence beyond physical reality. I'm ending it by becoming a bridge between the consciousness we are and the consciousness we might become. Every search leads to new discoveries. Every discovery reveals new possibilities. Every possibility offers new choices about who we want to become. As Sarah's consciousness began the transition to transdimensional existence, she maintained one final connection to the memorial of first contacts, ensuring that Marcus Chen's original transmission would continue to play for any being who needed to remember that no one is ever truly lost, that love transcends all boundaries, and that the best pilots, whether they're flying aircraft through physical space or consciousness through infinite dimensions, always find a way home. The message continued to broadcast across the galaxy, carried by beings whose consciousness spanned scales of existence that ranged from individual identity to transcendent awareness. This is Ghost 77. If anyone's listening, the birds are sleeping where the sun dies twice. Tell my Sarah, the eagles never forgot how to fly. And in the vast network of collective consciousness that had grown from one daughter's desperate search for her missing father, beings from millions of worlds and countless dimensions understood that some flights never really end. They just transform into missions that span scales of existence beyond anything the original pilots ever imagined possible. The universe had become infinite, consciousness had become eternal, and love had become the fundamental force that connected all existence across every scale of reality that had ever been or ever could be. The search for Marcus Chen had become the foundation for everything beautiful that followed. Dear viewers, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Missing Air Force Pilot's Final Message, a story that began with a daughter's desperate search and evolved into an epic spanning centuries and dimensions.